March 1945. A makeshift field hospital near the Rhine. The scent of gauze soaked in carbolic acid. The hum of distant artillery muffled by stone walls. She had not seen her reflection clearly in 3 years. Nurse Margaret Hoffman stood in the corridor of what had once been a schoolhouse. Her hands cracked and red from lye soap. Her nails chipped down to the quick. The hem of her gray wool uniform was stained with mud and something darker rust-colored patches she no longer tried to wash out. Around her, the walls were pocked with strapping scars. The windows, long since shattered, had been covered with oilcloth that flapped in the wind. Outside, the sound of American jeeps rumbled closer, their engines a low, unfamiliar growl that made her stomach tighten.
She had been told they were coming. The soldiers, what remained of them, had already surrendered. The officers had burned their papers in the courtyard 2 nights before, the smoke rising black and acrid into a sky that no longer belonged to Germany. Now it was just the nurses, the wounded, and the waiting. When the first American medics arrived, Margaretti expected efficiency. She expected protocol.
She had been trained by the Reichsarbeitsdienst, had served in field hospitals from the Eastern Front to the Ardennes. She knew how occupations worked. She had seen Russian soldiers in the villages near Königsberg. She knew what happened to the women left behind, but the American women who stepped through the doorway that afternoon were nothing like she expected. They wore clean uniforms, pressed, olive drab with red crosses stitched onto white armbands. Their boots were polished, their hair was pinned neatly under caps, and when one of them smiled, actually smiled, Margaret felt something inside her crack, something she hadn't known was still intact enough to break. One of the American nurses approached her. She was young, perhaps 25, with freckles across her nose, and a voice that was startling in its gentleness. "You've been working here alone?" the American asked in halting German. Margaret nodded. Her throat was too dry to speak. The American looked around the room at the rows of men on straw mattresses, at the buckets of soiled bandages, at the single kerosene lamp flickering in the corner. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out something small, metallic, gold-cased, a lipstick. She held it out. "For you," she said. Margaret stared at it. For a long moment she did not move. She did not understand. This was not rations. This was not medicine. This was not a weapon or a tool or anything that made sense in the language of war she had learned to speak. It was a lipstick, a small gold tube of red lipstick, and in that moment, standing in a bombed-out schoolhouse on the edge of a defeated empire, Margaret Hoffman realized that she had forgotten what it meant to be a woman. In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces swept across the collapsing Third Reich, tens of thousands of German medical personnel found themselves in a strange and disorienting limbo. They were not quite prisoners of war nurses, and doctors were classified as non-combatants under the Geneva Conventions. But neither were they free. They were held in camps, requisitioned hospitals, and occupied facilities, waiting to be processed, waiting to be judged, waiting to see what the victors would do with them. For years, these women had been told the story. It was a story about enemies, about subhuman Bolsheviks who raped and burned, about decadent Anglo-Americans who carpet-bombed civilians and cared nothing for European civilization. It was a story that had been drilled into them through newsreels and radio broadcasts, through the speeches of Goebbels and the pages of de Schwarzenkarps. They had been taught to expect cruelty from the Allies, especially from the Soviets, but also from the Americans. Those mongrel capitalists with their jazz music and their chewing gum and their supposed moral decay. But when the Americans arrived, they did not come with whips or chains. They came with chocolate bars, with cigarettes, with nylon stockings, and yes, with lipstick. The gesture seemed absurd, trivial. In a continent drowning in rubble and corpses, what possible meaning could a tube of cosmetics hold? And yet, for the women who received them, these small acts of inexplicable kindness struck deeper than any propaganda ever had. Because they were not just gifts, they were symbols, symbols of a world these women had been told did not exist, a world where abundance was ordinary, where femininity was not a weakness, where even in the midst of total war, there was room for something as unnecessary, as frivolous, as beautiful as lipstick. To understand the shock of that moment, one must first understand what these women had endured. By 1945, German nurses had been serving in a war machine that had stretched itself to the breaking point, unlike their American counterparts who rotated in 1939 and 1940 had given way to the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, where nurses worked in dugouts and cellars with temperatures well below zero, where frostbite claimed. As many men as bullets and where supplies dwindled to almost nothing, Nurse Hildegard Muller, who served in a field hospital near Stalingrad, later wrote in her diary, "We had no morphine left. We used vodka. We had no bandages left. We tore up sheets, then curtains, then our own undergarments. In the end, we had nothing left but our hands. And sometimes that was not enough." These were not women who had been sheltered from the war. They had seen the worst of it. They had held down screaming boys 17, 18 years old, while surgeons amputated limbs without anesthesia. They had watched men die from infections that penicillin could have cured, if only they had penicillin. They had been bombed, shelled, and strafed. They had been hungry, cold, exhausted, and they had been told over and over that this suffering had meaning, that they were serving the fatherland, that their sacrifices would be remembered, that the war, if only they could endure a little longer, would be won. But by the spring of 1945, even the most fanatical believers could no longer ignore the reality. The Americans were crossing the Rhine. The Soviets were closing in from the east. The Luftwaffe had been reduced to a ghost. The cities were in ruins, and the men they had once nursed back to health were now boys, old men, and walking wounded sent back to the front with empty rifles. The myth was collapsing. When the American forces arrived, the German nurses expected the same brutality they had witnessed from their own side. They had seen what happened in occupied territories. They had heard the rumors from the east. They braced themselves for violence. But instead, the Americans were puzzled by them. Lieutenant Ruth Harrison, an Army nurse from Ohio, recalled her first encounter with German medical staff in a memoir published in 1952. "They looked at us like we were ghosts, or maybe like we were angels. I don't know. But there was this fear in their eyes, and also something else, disbelief maybe, like they couldn't understand why we weren't hurting them." The Americans had been briefed on what to expect. They had seen the propaganda posters, the ones that depicted Germans as monsters, as fanatics who would fight to the last man. But when they entered the hospitals and aid stations, they found exhausted women in threadbare uniforms, women who looked more like refugees than soldiers, women who were so malnourished that their uniforms hung off their frames like sacks. And the Americans, for their part, did what Americans did. They shared. It was not official policy. There were no orders from Eisenhower to distribute lipstick to former enemy personnel, but American soldiers and nurses had grown up in a culture of abundance, even in the Depression years, and they carried that abundance with them. They had more of everything: food, medicine, clothes, cigarettes, cosmetics, than they knew what to do with. And so they gave. A chocolate bar here, a pair of stockings there, a tube of lipstick pressed into the palm of a woman who had not worn makeup in 4 years. The German nurses did not know what to make of it. Some refused at first. They thought it was a trick or a test or some kind of humiliation. Nurse Anna Bergman later recalled, "I thought they were mocking us. Why would they give us lipstick? We had no mirrors, no running water. Men were dying in the next room. It seemed cruel." But the Americans were not mocking them. They were simply being American. There is a photograph taken in April 1945 in a hospital near Heidelberg. It is grainy, black and white, slightly out of focus. In it, a young German nurse sits on a wooden stool, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. Her hair, which has been hastily combed, falls in limp waves around her face. She is wearing lipstick, bright red, carefully applied. An American nurse stands beside her, smiling, one hand resting on the German woman's shoulder. The photograph was never published widely. It did not fit the narrative. The war was not yet over. There were still battles to be fought, still camps to be liberated, still atrocities to be uncovered. The image of an American nurse gently helping a German nurse apply lipstick was too soft, too human, too complicated for a public that still needed its enemies to be monsters. But the photograph exists, and in it you can see something shift.
The German nurse is not smiling. Her expression is unreadable, but her eyes are looking at something beyond the camera, perhaps at herself, perhaps at a future she had not imagined possible. The lipstick became a symbol, not immediately, not in any grand sweeping way, but but quietly, person by person, in the small private moments of transformation that history rarely records.
For women like Margaret A. Hoffman, the lipstick was the first indication that the world they had been promised by the Nazi regime was a lie. They'd been told that the Americans were degenerate, that American women were loose and immoral, that American culture was a wasteland of materialism and greed. But the women who arrived in those jeeps and trucks, who set up field hospitals and trauma wards with startling efficiency, who worked 20-hour shifts and never once raised a hand in anger, these women were nothing like the propaganda had claimed. They were competent, professional, kind, and they wore lipstick, not as a mark of vanity, but as a mark of humanity. A small insistence, even in the middle of a war, that they were still women, still individuals, still deserving of beauty and dignity. For the German nurses, this was a revelation. They had been taught that sacrifice meant erasure, that service to the state meant the surrender of self. They had been stripped of their femininity, their individuality, their freedom, all in the name of duty. They had been told that this was strength, that this was honor. But here were women who had not been erased, who had served their country without losing themselves, who had fought in a war and still found time to paint their lips. It was a kind of freedom the German nurses had not known existed. The records from the Allied occupation are filled with small, strange details that suggest how deeply these gestures resonated. In a displaced persons camp near Munich, a German nurse used a tube of American lipstick to trade for bread. She could have traded it for anything, cigarettes were the currency of post-war Europe, but she chose bread. She wanted to eat, but first she wanted to feel human again. In a hospital in Frankfurt, a group of German nurses pooled their lipstick rations, 1 tube, for every 5 women and used it only on Sundays. They called it their Sonntagsrot, their Sunday red. It was a ritual, a way of marking time, a way of saying, we are still here, we are still ourselves. In a letter dated May 1945, discovered in the archives of the International Red Cross, a German nurse wrote to her sister, "The Americans gave me a lipstick today. I do not know why. I have not worn lipstick since before the war. I do not even have a mirror. But I put it on anyway, using the reflection in a window. And for the first time in years, I saw myself. Not a nurse, not a German, just myself. Just herself. That was the power of it, not the lipstick itself, but what it represented. A return to individuality, a rejection of the totalitarian erasure that had defined the last decade of their lives. Of course, not all German nurses experienced this transformation. Some remained hardened, embittered, unwilling to let go of the ideology that had shaped them. Some saw the American kindness as weakness, as proof that the Americans did not understand the harsh realities of war. Some took the lipstick and felt nothing but resentment, but others, many others, felt the first stirrings of doubt. They began to ask questions. If the Americans were so decadent, why were they winning? If German discipline and sacrifice were so superior, why had the Reich collapsed? If the propaganda had been wrong about the Americans, what else had it been wrong about? These were dangerous questions. Questions that could unravel everything. And for some, they did. Lieutenant Erika Stern had been a true believer. She had joined the Bund Deutscher Madel at age 10, had volunteered for nursing service at 18, had served in Poland, France, and Russia. She had seen the mass graves in the East. She had been told they were necessary. She had believed it. But when she was captured by American forces in April 1945, something shifted. It was not one moment. It was a series of small, accumulating realizations. The American nurses did not treat her like an enemy. They treated her like a colleague. They asked her about her training, her techniques, her experiences. They listened. One evening, an American nurse named Dorothy sat beside her in the mess hall and shared a cigarette. They did not speak the same language fluently, so they communicated in broken German and hand gestures. Dorothy showed Erika a
Photograph of her family, her mother, her father, her 2 brothers. One of the brothers was in uniform. He fought in France, Dorothy said. Erika stiffened. I was in France, she said quietly. Dorothy nodded. She did not look angry. She just looked sad. War is stupid, Dorothy said. And then she handed Erika a tube of lipstick.
but we are not. That night, Erika sat alone in the barracks and applied the lipstick. She stared at herself in the small hand mirror Dorothy had lent her. She looked at her own face, at the red on her lips, and for herself to cry. Not for Germany, not for the Fuhrer, not for the war, but for herself, for the girl she had been before all of this.
For the woman she might still become. The lipstick was not the only symbol. There were others, the chocolate bars that tasted impossibly sweet, the nylon stockings that did not tear, the cigarettes that were not made from sawdust, the soap that actually lathered. But the lipstick was the most intimate, the most personal, because it was not about survival, it was about identity. Food and medicine were necessities, but lipstick was a choice, a declaration, an insistence that life was more than just survival, that humanity was more than just function. And for women who had spent years being reduced to instruments of the state, that insistence was revolutionary.
By the summer of 1945, as the occupation settled into a new normalcy, the contrast between the American forces and the defeated German population became even starker. The Americans set up recreation centers. They organized dances. They showed movies, Hollywood films in Technicolor, full of music and romance and happy endings. They handed out magazines, glossy publications filled with advertisements for cars and refrigerators and, yes, cosmetics. To the Germans, it was surreal. Obscene even. How could a nation at war produce such abundance? How could soldiers who had just fought across a continent have time for dancing and movies and lipstick? The answer, of course, was that America had never been at war the way Germany had been at war. American cities had not been bombed. American factories had not been destroyed. The American economy had not been hollowed out by total mobilization. America had fought the war with one hand and built a consumer paradise with the other. This was incomprehensible to the Germans.
They had been taught that war required total sacrifice, that victory demanded the surrender of all comfort, all luxury, all individuality. They had been told that the Allies could only win because they were weak, because they lacked the discipline and will to endure hardship. But here was proof that the opposite was true. The Americans had won not because they sacrificed everything, but because they didn't have to. There is a diary entry from a German nurse named Ursula Koenig, dated June 1945. I saw an American soldier today eating an orange in June. I have not seen an orange in 5 years. He peeled it slowly, casually, as if it were nothing, as if the whole world were not starving.
And then he offered me a slice. I did not know whether to laugh or cry. That orange, like the lipstick, was a symbol of a nation so wealthy, so powerful, that even its soldiers, its common soldiers, had access to luxuries that German civilians could only dream of. It was humbling. It was humiliating. It was undeniable. The transformation was not immediate. It took months, sometimes years, for the full weight of these experiences to settle in. But slowly, steadily, the women who had served the Third Reich began to rebuild their identities. They learned English. They read American newspapers. They listened to jazz on the Armed Forces radio. They attended lectures on democracy and human rights.
They watched as the Americans dismantled the Nazi state and replaced it with something new, something messy and imperfect, but also something undeniably freer. And many of them came to a painful conclusion. They had been lied to, not just by the propaganda, not just by Goebbels and Hitler, but by the entire system, the entire ideology, the entire worldview they had been raised to believe.
They had been told that strength came from submission, that freedom was chaos, that individuality was selfishness, that beauty was decadence. But the Americans proved otherwise. The Americans were strong because they were free. They were disciplined because they chose to be, not because they were forced. They were generous because they could afford to be. And they were beautiful. Yes, beautiful, because they refused to let the war take that from them. Not everyone accepted this. Some German nurses clung to the old ideology, insisting that the Americans had simply been lucky, that history would vindicate the Reich, that the real battle, the ideological battle, was still to come. But for those who did accept it, the transformation was profound. Nurse Margaret Hoffman, the woman who had been given that first tube of lipstick in March 1945, went on to work as a translator for the American occupation forces. She married an American soldier in 1947 and emigrated to the United States in 1948. In an interview conducted in 1983, she was asked what had changed her mind about America. She paused for a long time before answering. It was not one thing, she said. It was many small things. But if I had to choose one moment, one symbol, It would be that lipstick, because it told me something I had not been allowed to believe. That I was still a person. That I still mattered. Not as a nurse. Not as a German. But as a woman, as myself. The story of German nurses and American lipstick is not one that appears in most history books. It is too small, too personal, too ambiguous. It is a story that reveals a deeper truth about the war and about the ideologies that clashed during it. The Nazi regime had built itself on the promise of strength through sacrifice.
It had demanded total obedience, total conformity, total surrender of the self to the state. And for a time, that ideology had seemed unstoppable. But it was brittle, because it was built on fear, on coercion, on the suppression of everything that made people human, their individuality, their freedom, their capacity for joy and beauty and love.
The Americans, by contrast, had built their society on a different principle that freedom and abundance were not weaknesses, but strengths, that people fought harder when they had something to fight for, not just something to fear, that a soldier who could go home to a decent meal, a warm bed, and a tube of lipstick was a better soldier than one who had been ground down to nothing, and in the end, that principle won. There's a photograph, taken in 1950, of a group of former German nurses at a reunion in Hamburg. They are smiling. They are wearing lipstick red, pink, coral, every shade imaginable. They look healthy, happy, free. In the center of the photograph, Margaret Hoffman holds up a small gold tube. It is tarnished now, empty, but she has kept it all these years.
This, she told a reporter, was the beginning of my new life, not the end of the war, not the fall of the Reich, not the trials at Nuremberg, but a lipstick, a small, ridiculous, beautiful tube of lipstick, handed to her by a stranger who saw her not as an enemy, but as a woman. And in that moment, the wall came down. Not the wall of Berlin, that would take decades, but the wall in her mind.
The wall that had been built by years of propaganda, by fear and hatred and lies, had crumbled. And on the other side, she found herself, in the decades that followed, as the Cold War hardened into a new ideological battle. The story of the lipstick took on new meanings. It became a parable about the power of soft diplomacy, about winning hearts and minds, about the American way of life as a weapon more powerful than any bomb. And perhaps that is true, but it is also simpler than that. Because for the women who lived through it, the lipstick was not a political statement. It was not a propaganda tool. It was not a weapon. It was a gift, a small human gesture that said, "You are not my enemy. You are my sister."
Perfect.
And sometimes in the aftermath of total war, that is the most radical thing you can say. The symbolism of the lipstick, the recurring image that threads through this story, is not accidental. It represents something fundamental about the American experience of the war.
While Germany had mobilized every ounce of its economy for military production, while Britain had endured rationing and blackouts, while the Soviet Union had sacrificed tens of millions of lives, America had done something extraordinary. It had fought a global war while simultaneously raising its standard of living.
American women worked in factories, yes. They planted victory gardens and collected scrap metal. But they also bought lipstick, because American companies, even in wartime, continued to produce consumer goods. Because the American government believed that maintaining morale meant maintaining normalcy. Because the American people believed that freedom meant choice. Even the choice to wear red lipstick in the middle of a world war. To the Germans, this was incomprehensible. To the Americans, it was obvious. And in that difference lay the outcome of the war. The lipstick also carried a gendered meaning that cannot be ignored. For German women, femininity had been weaponized by the Nazi regime. They were told to be mothers, breeders, caretakers of the race. Their bodies belonged to the state. Their purpose was biological. Even as nurses, they were valued not for their skill or intelligence, but for their service, their obedience, their willingness to sacrifice. American women, by contrast, had negotiated a more complicated relationship with femininity.
They were workers and soldiers and nurses, yes, but they were also still women. They wore uniforms, but they also wore lipstick. They served their country, but they did not erase themselves in the process. This was a profound difference.
And for German nurses, encountering American nurses was often the first time they had seen a model of womanhood that was both strong and free, both competent and feminine, both selfless and individual. It was a revelation. and for some, it was a liberation. By the 1950s, as West Germany rebuilt under the Marshall Plan, the lessons of the lipstick had permeated the culture.
German women began to embrace a new ideal of femininity, one that borrowed heavily from American models. They wore makeup, they dressed fashionably, they worked, but they also pursued personal fulfillment. This was not without controversy. Some saw it as a betrayal of German values, others saw it as a necessary evolution.
But for the nurses who had been there, who had received those first tubes of lipstick in the rubble of 1945, it was simply a continuation of what they had learned in those early, disorienting days of occupation, that humanity was not weakness, that beauty was not frivolity, that freedom meant the right to choose, even if what you chose was something as small, as seemingly insignificant, as a color for your lips. In the end, the story of the lipstick is a story about symbols and what they reveal. A tube of lipstick is a small thing. It weighs almost nothing. It costs almost nothing. It does nothing practical. It will not feed you or clothe you or shelter you, but it can remind you that you are human, that you are an individual, that you have the right to beauty, to dignity, to self-expression, and in a world that had just spent 6 years trying to strip people of their humanity, that reminder was everything. Today, if you visit the archives in Germany, the museums dedicated to the war, the libraries that hold the letters and diaries of that generation, you will find, tucked among the documents, small remnants of those years, a ration card, a photograph, a medal, and sometimes, preserved in tissue paper, a tube of lipstick. American-made, red or pink or coral, empty now, but still gleaming faintly in the archival light. These objects are displayed without much fanfare. They are footnotes to the larger story. But they are there, quiet witnesses to a moment when the world shifted, when ideology met reality, when propaganda met kindness, and when a small golden tube became a bridge between enemies. The German nurses who received those lipsticks are nearly all gone now. The last of them would be in their 90s if they are still alive. Their stories have mostly faded into history, eclipsed by the grander narratives of battles and treaties and political transformations. But the lipstick remains, not as a relic of vanity, but as a symbol of something more enduring. It is a symbol of the idea that freedom is not just political or economic, but personal. That democracy is not just a system of government, but a way of life. That the true measure of a civilization is not how much it can sacrifice, but how much it can preserve joy, beauty, individuality, humanity, even in the darkest times. And it is a reminder that sometimes in the aftermath of unimaginable destruction, the smallest gestures carry the greatest weight. A chocolate bar shared, a photograph shown, a tube of lipstick offered. These are not the things that win wars, but they are the things that win peace.
And in the spring of 1945, as the guns fell silent and the ruins of Europe began to smolder in the light of a new day, it was these small acts of grace that planted the seeds of what would come next. Not revenge, not occupation, but reconstruction, reconciliation, redemption. And it began for some with a lipstick. March 1945, a makeshift field hospital near the Rhine.
The scent of gauze soaked in carbolic acid, the hum of distant artillery muffled by stone walls. A woman stands in the corridor, her hands cracked and red, her uniform stained with the evidence of years of war. An American nurse approaches, smiles, and offers a small, golden tube. The German nurse takes it. She does not yet understand what it means. She does not yet know that this moment will change her.